Hello and welcome to Oh Sing Joyfully. It's our first episode of a series that is going to be about choral music, specifically in a religious and liturgical context. This is the first of 4 videos that we're going to be doing about the Psalms. My name is Grahame Hunter. I'm a laywoman and choir member at the Cathedral Church of St. Paul in Detroit, Michigan. And with me is Jeremy David Tarrant, our organist and choir master. Hi, Jeremy.
Hello, Grahame.
So it's our first episode about the Psalms today, and probably as good a place to start as any is, what are the Psalms?
Exactly. Gosh, we could have so many episodes on the Psalms and their place in worship and indeed society. We could exhaust, but if we were just to talk about it briefly, I think to think of the Psalms as a songbook of prayer is a great place to start, because we know that they were meant to be sung. These 150 prayers were meant to be sung. They were probably composed for corporate singing, choral singing of some sort, and to be accompanied by string instruments. And it's interesting because as printed in the Bible, when you see the Psalms in the Bible, as opposed to when you see them in the prayer book, there are rubrics before Psalms 75 and 76 that specifically are notes to the choir master about how they should be sung, what tunes to use, and how they should be accompanied. I think also to think about the Psalms they're timeless and they're enduring. And think of the ones that we go to at various times in our lives. At burial, the 23rd Psalm.
Or every Maundy Thursday for the stripping of the altars.
Exactly.
It's always Psalm 22.
Exactly. And they run the gamut of human emotion. It's all there. And it's interesting, I was reading a quote by John Calvin, who said that the Psalms are really like looking into a mirror. And he said, we find reflected every color of the human heart and every shade of the human experience. And earlier, one of the early church teachers, Bishop Athanasius, who I know you are a particular fan of Bishop Athanasius.
Well, he explains the Trinity so well without committing heresy, which is difficult. Right. So 3 cheers for him, I say.
Right, exactly. But Athanasius says that the Psalms always become the immediate and personal words of everyone who prays them. The Psalms have been a part of worship for thousands of years. From the temple and the synagogue, we know that Psalms were a part of the worship practiced by Jesus and his disciples. We see this in the Gospels, that they sang Psalms, that this was part of their worship. And they've had a place in the services of the church from the very, very beginning. They are really, as a colleague of mine likes to say, they are the backbone of the morning and evening office, morning prayer, evening prayer, or evensong if it's a choral setting, and compline. We have them at noonday prayer. They are a part of that worship, and they are part of liturgy of the word in Eucharist as well. So I think one commentator sort of sums it up best by saying that, look, what you have in the Psalms is a liturgical hymnal of the people of God.
Mm-hmm. And so at this point, it doesn't matter, who wrote them. They're traditionally ascribed to David, King David, and being part of the Hebrew scriptures and originally written in Hebrew, and so we share them with our Jewish neighbors. But yeah, when you think about it like that, it feels like they belong to all of us. And I know that certainly I have, when I've had very strong emotions, I've personally gone paging through the Psalter, kind of going, where's one that matches?
Mhm.
And there always is one.
Yeah.
Because I often find, if I'm very sad or very angry, it's hard for me to find the words to articulate that a lot of the time. But and of course, now I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but there's a psalm that includes the line, "Save us, O Lord, for the water is up to our necks." And I remember the first time I read that, I was like, oh, that's how I feel.
Yeah.
But that's true with nearly every psalm I've encountered. So.
Yeah. And there are great stories of salvation in the Psalms. Um, one of there's a setting. Which psalm is it? I would come
Is
to
it
this.
they that go down to the sea?
They that go down to the sea in ships. I mean, there's that wonderful choral setting of it by Herbert Sumption that a lot of choirs know. I know it's a particular favorite of choristers because they get to sing like staggering, like drunken men,
Well, and Sumption's music matches that text so perfectly.
Yeah, he paints it.
I mean,
so
you
well.
you feel a little seasick singing it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you feel a little seasick by the end, you've done a good job of it. But there is an example of a great story of salvation. I think one time I said to you, maybe, it's so sad that psalm doesn't come up in the lectionary often enough that we can put that anthem in. And then we were talking. I think we said, well, why not put it on St. Paul, the feast of St. Paul? It's a great story of
Exactly what we
salvation.
did.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, so now that we've sort of established, what the Psalms are, where they're found in the scriptures, shall we move on to how we work with them at the cathedral?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. I know that in subsequent episodes, we're going to talk about what is Anglican chant, what is plain chant, and those things. So we'll do that later, but I just a little bit of background. When I came to the cathedral, I should say that prior to my arrival in 1994 as assistant organist, and boy, was I wet behind the ears. Gosh, I shudder to think what that, was like in those days. But
That was 2 years before I was born.
Oh, you would point that out. Right, but I don't really have a clear sense of, I know what was kind of happening with them just before I got there. Prior to that, we're going back into the days of morning prayer still being the principal service. So I don't know exactly, was that all done by the choir at the principal service? I would have to do some research into that. When I got there, there was not, the cathedral was not, didn't have services of evensong or choral evensong regularly. They were sort of occasional and were attached to certain events happening as opposed to just part of our calendar. So we didn't really encounter the sung psalms as part of evensong, evening prayer. The practice when I first got there was almost exclusively that they were sung by all in the principal service on Sunday morning, sung by all to simplified Anglican chant, and we'll talk about what that is. I know in a subsequent episode. My predecessor, David Bartlett, I was his assistant for the first 5 years of my time at the cathedral. 4 years, 5 years, I can't remember now. But with the support of the then dean, who was new on the scene in my second year at the cathedral, David really began to restore the choral tradition of psalm singing in the principal service and the singing of the psalms as a function of the choir, more in line with what one finds in a cathedral. So that began to creep back into the service, and when I then took over from him, I was encouraged to continue that development. And I was blessed to have a cathedral leadership who understood that the only way for the choir to do it well was to be doing it, that it was constant practice. And I'm really pleased to say that I think the cathedral choir does a really great job of it. And also that it's, the cathedral in Detroit is one of the few places left that you find that to be the regular practice.
And we tell the treble choristers that all the time. You know, every time they're like, oh, once again with the reciting note 1, 2, 3, you know,
Yeah.
we say, hey, you are heirs to a glorious choral tradition that few practice anymore. So,
A glorious,
yes, reciting note 1, 2, 3, go.
a glorious choral tradition, but one that is definitely not a museum piece.
No, not at all.
It's very much a living tradition. There are new psalm chants being written all the time. This is something that is enjoyed by a lot of people, and a lot of people are fed by that kind of composition. Currently, well, and for the last several years, I've had the help of two of our choirmen, Jim Hooker, one of our altos, and Ray Stillwell, one of our basses, who is also a former assistant organist of the cathedral, in helping me to create a psalter, a chant psalter that is specifically for our cathedral. And in that, we've commissioned new chants. So it really is a very living tradition, and I like that part of it too. It's not some antique piece, you know. But
right. Well, and that is something, the compiling of a psalter for a particular place, that is a done thing. You know, we didn't invent that. I know that you have several volumes of psalters from various other cathedrals that I believe you reference. And
yeah, there is one published that was for use in the Episcopal Church that a lot of people use. I mean, it was certainly a resource for me. It continues to be, actually. But you know, the selection of the pairing of the chants, the Anglican chants, with the pointed psalms is a sort of personal thing. Sometimes you have one written by, you know, I included in ours are chants by my predecessor, David Bartlett. Some of our past assistant organists have written some Anglican chants for it, and so it does take on, you know, a sort of some local flavor. But
and it contributes to the habit. You
yeah.
know, we talk about the habit being important. I've sung in the choir at the cathedral for 5 seasons now, and then I was on leave for 2 seasons to go to graduate school, and now I'm back in such strange times.
We're so glad you're back, though. Yeah.
I'm so glad to be back, but certainly over those 5 years, and it doesn't even take that long, you know, you get a sense of, oh yes, we're doing this psalm, and here is this very familiar chant that we know. Like you'll sit down at the piano and you'll say, okay, on reciting note 1, 2, 3, and you'll start to play it, and we'll all go, this one, that's a good one.
Yeah.
And so, you know, because it's become, you know, part of the locality of, this is the chant that we use with this particular psalm. And I know we'll discuss that in a later episode as well when we talk about translations.
Right, and the pointing of them. And what I mean by pointing is, how are the phrases and syllables arranged to line up with the chords of the chant, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent episode. But that the pointing also, there are some personal things about pointing. Psalm pointing can be a very personal thing. Organists will tell you also that there are some elements of hymn playing that are very personal to them. You know, all of my assistants and associate organists at the cathedral, I always say, you know, we all have our personal things, but here's how we do this here, you know. but pointing becomes a very personal thing. There can also be some pretty wrong pointing. I should tell you that one time we had a visiting choir. This was when I was the assistant organist, and there was a visiting choir coming for evensong. And my then predecessor, who was my boss, gave me the psalm the next morning and said, I want you to correct this pointing. And it was an exercise for me. So there are things you learn about it, but there are also very personal things about the pointing as well.
Yeah. Well, and again, going back to, you mentioned that the predecessor to the current dean understood that in order to get good at Anglican chant, you have to do it all the time.
Yes.
Reminds me of, we were on choir tour in England in the summer of 2014, and we spent a week in residence at Chichester Cathedral, which was just lovely. I personally have very, very fond memories of that residence. and the cathedral staff there. So if anyone from Chichester is watching this, Detroit loves ya. But we were on our way. We'd done some sort of day excursion, and we were supposed to come back and sing Evensong that evening. And either our coach driver took a very strange route, or there was just traffic was a nightmare on the highway. But we got back with enough time to step off of the coach, vest. I think we ran through the psalm chant once, and then you went to go play the prelude while we lined up in the ambulatory or wherever we were supposed to go. And there were absolutely no problems about singing the service, even though we had not rehearsed it that day, because we had prepared so well by singing, just singing a lot of Anglican chant in general, but by making sure we knew those psalms inside and out before we left the States.
Yeah.
And it was a nerve-wracking experience in terms of, oh, are we going to be late? But I didn't find it nerve-wracking in terms of, oh, do we know our music? That was never the question.
Yeah. It really is, it doesn't really matter about the psalm at hand. It's the practice you have of chanting it, the how you give the stress, the timing, the pacing, and all of that. You mentioned that Chichester trip, and I was so pleased as punch when in the course of that week, one of the clergy of Chichester Cathedral said to me after a service, he said, this is some of the best psalm singing by a visiting American choir we've ever experienced here. I was so pleased with that because I thought, okay, so we're doing it, we're doing it well. But currently in the cathedral, during the choir season, the choir sings the psalm at the principal service at the 11 o'clock Eucharist. We use Anglican chant for that, except during Advent and Lent when we use plain chant. That was a sort of local custom that my predecessor adopted late in his time there, and I've kept that because it also exposes the choir and the choristers to singing those psalms to plain chant, or if you want to call it Gregorian chant. We sing the psalms to plain chant at choral evensong, but they are also sung at what we call cathedral evensong. So here in the Detroit Cathedral, we have choral evensong sung by the choir on the second and fourth Sundays of the month, and then on the other Sundays we have a congregational version of evensong where it's mostly sung by the congregation, and they chant the psalms to what we call simplified Anglican chant. At other times in the year, we employ other methods. When the choir's not in session, the congregation, mostly during the summer or during choir breaks, will sing the psalms in a responsorial fashion, maybe with a repeated antiphon or refrain that the congregation has to sing in alternation with a cantor who's chanting the verses. At other times, the congregation will sing it to simplified chant, and at some times it's simply read. They're simply read. Personally, I like to have them sung all the time because they are meant. It adds that dimension to them. But yeah, we use them in a variety. We sing them in a variety of ways.
Just thinking about all of the places one can go to find psalms if one is missing them, sung to Anglican chant, since we can't be in churches right now, which is good and correct because we want to keep everybody safe. But I know that plenty of English choirs have albums of them on your streaming service of choice, or I believe the BBC is still broadcasting. They would be pre-recorded, of course, but choral evensong on Wednesdays is one of the best places to find full recordings of that. And that especially, I have found, tends to have a wide variety of chants. If you're looking for something that's maybe a bit newer, you'll often get commissioned chants or anthems on the evensongs broadcast by the BBC.
We have some of them on the cathedral's SoundCloud
Yes,
area.
we do.
I think if you just go to Detroit Cathedral Choir on SoundCloud, there's a lot
I'm
of
double
texts,
checking that.
but some of them are the Psalms as well. And right
Yes,
now,
Detroit Cathedral Choir on SoundCloud.
yeah, and right now I'm grateful to one of our altos, Jennifer Hart, who has been great about recording some services in the cathedral. So we have some of those banked, some of the Psalms that we've been fortunate to use on our Zoom services, and our sort of virtual worship during this pandemic. So she had been banking some of those, and actually more recently with some upgrades and things to recording equipment and possibilities in the cathedral. We're looking forward to having a lot more of that available as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, do you have anything else for sort of our introduction to Psalms?
Well, I'm so glad you're doing this, and it's great to talk about these things. I know that in subsequent episodes we'll sort of talk about the various kinds of chants and stuff like that. But I would encourage people listening, if you have a question, just drop us an email at music@detroitcathedral.org, music@detroitcathedral.org, and we're happy to see if we can address some of these in this series. So yeah, so thank you so much for the opportunity to talk like this, and that's really great.
Of course. So, like I said at the beginning, this is going to be a 4-episode little mini series on the Psalms. So our next episode is going to be on Anglican chant, and after that we'll have one on plain chant, and our final Psalm-related episode will be about Psalm translations. So we'll talk about metrical Psalms, in translating something from Hebrew to, in our case, English, do you prioritize literal meaning? Do you prioritize the sound of the words? So I think we'll have a lot of fun digging into that. And I imagine, of course, if you do send those questions, in addition to suggestions for maybe other topics you would like us to talk about, but send us those questions to music@detroitcathedral.org, and we can get around to answering those in subsequent episodes as well.
Absolutely.
And there are a number of places on the internet where you can find us. We are on Facebook at Cathedral Church of St. Paul, Detroit. There is also a separate page for music, which is music at the Cathedral Church of St. Paul. We are on Instagram at St. Paul's Detroit. That is Saint abbreviated ST, Paul's Detroit, no apostrophe. We are on YouTube at the Cathedral Church of St. Paul. Our podcast is also the Cathedral Church of St. Paul, and we are hoping to have this available both as a YouTube video and audio only on the podcast, which is available on your favorite podcatcher. And as we mentioned before, we are Detroit Cathedral Choir on SoundCloud, where we have a lot of live recordings of the choir doing anthems, psalms, hymns from various points in the liturgical year. So we hope that you have enjoyed this first episode of Oh Sing Joyfully, and we will be back with you soon.
Thanks so much, Mary. It's been great to chat with you today. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.